It's okay to eat fish, 'cause they don't have any feelings. Something on the way, yeah. Something on the way, yeah. How about in this video? You ain't seen my fucking face in a while. I'm gonna be discussing House of the Dragon. I don't even know what the topic's gonna be. Who knows how long it's gonna be? It's been like 2 weeks since I've uploaded, so I decided to just do an unedited, what would have potentially been a live stream, but put into video format. Before I jump into any of that, please do me a massive favor and slap a like on this video. The like goal will be as many as possible. At least 2. But as many as possible. Also, make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications turned on. So that way you'll get an alert every single time I drop a House of the Dragon or a Song of Ice and Fire video. Don't have to wait for House of the Dragon Season 1 or Winds of Winter. But as it's known on this channel, the long night is Aldrizas, Boozdari, Ixos, Daora. Alright, so since this is a House of the Dragon video, and like I said, I didn't know what the contents of this video would be, let's just talk about some of the main characters and 5 random facts about each of them. Let's start off with everyone's favorite, Daemon. Alright, so Daemon, he doesn't have his first legitimately born child until the twins that he has with Laena Velaryon, who is the sister of Rhaenyra Velaryon, who is the husband of Rhaenyra. Right? One of the bastard children that he has is with Mysaria, and Daemon gives her a dragon egg. She's like basically Daemon's paramour for a little bit, but his brother, King Viserys, is like, nah, little bro. That ain't happening. So Daemon ends up sending Mysaria away across the narrow sea, and she ends up losing the child at sea. Daemon is extremely pissed at his brother for this, but ultimately they end up reconciling. Another little-known fact about Daemon is that even though he's a prince and he rides a dragon and he's got a bunch of men that will do anything he wants to, he was actually known as the Prince of the City. He got into several different quarrels and killed several men in King's Landing, on the streets, being a prince with his own hands. He did this not because, like some other Targaryen princes, Aerion Brightflame, you know, they're bitches and they can't back their words up. Daemon is very much the opposite of that. He does have that typical Targaryen heir apparent kind of syndrome, which makes them, to the simple person and the average show watcher, you could just say they have, you know, the Targaryen madness. But also his is much refined. And because he is so good at backing up what he says, it makes his ego even bigger. Because he knows that ultimately, if he were to lose or be, you know, at risk of losing his life, he is still the, you know, Prince of the City and has the Targaryen power that comes along with being a silver-haired, purple-eyed individual during this time period. So ultimately he could call the Gold Cloaks. Oh yeah, and then another random fact about him is before he actually came to King's Landing and was a part of the court and ultimately ended up becoming the Lord Commander of the Gold Cloaks, which is the City Watch, they were a ragtag team of individuals. They barely had any like weapons that would allow them to patrol King's Landing. Now, mind you, this is 100 years or so after Aegon's conquest, so King's Landing hasn't necessarily been around that long, but Daemon, after he becomes the Lord Commander, he gives them a uniform, like actual decent weaponry, and he gives them like golden cloaks, and that's where they get the nickname of the Gold Cloaks for the city. And if it feels like I'm fumbling around for words, this is all literally off the top of my head. One of the things, I guess I've mentioned enough random facts about Daemon. One of the things that I'm most looking forward to is his relationship with Viserys. Because if these two brothers were amalgamated together, they'd be the perfect king. Like, Targaryen power is at its apex when Daemon's older brother Viserys takes the reins. And because he is much more amiable than his brother, he kind of just is allowed to be the king. He actually throws so many feasts and tourneys and all that good shit that he's known as the party king. He's very much influenced by the people that are surrounding him. Like, he may come up with an idea to do something, but if others around him don't like that idea, they could easily influence him to change his mind. That's the type of dude Viserys was. Daemon, complete opposite of that. Once he made his mind up, that's what he's going to do. Like, he was never named Prince of Dragonstone, which is in Westerosi history and in Targaryen history. Whoever's named Prince of Dragonstone, whoever resides at Dragonstone, is technically next in line for the Iron Throne. That's obviously not the case when Stannis is there, when King Robert, in the main storyline, 300 or I guess 200 years after the events of this, when Robert destroys the remnants of the Targaryen dynasty, Stannis is given Dragonstone, but not because he's next in line for the Iron Throne. Obviously, Joffrey who is Cersei's twins. Y'all know about that shit. I don't know why I'm talking about it. But basically, because Daemon was denied that, you're next in line for the Iron Throne. Your brother's the king. He technically only has one daughter right now and no male heirs, right? Because he was never given that, and I just relating this back to once he sets his mind up, his whole journey is all about getting more power, at least until the dance actually starts in 130 AC. His whole journey is about getting more and more power. He goes down to the Stepstones to carve out his own kingdom because he isn't made the Prince of Dragonstone. That's his whole quest. And it's actually interesting because Viserys mentions that, let Daemon play at war. Keeps him out of trouble here at court, right? So Daemon is going to be my favorite character for sure, but his relationship with Viserys is going to be interesting because like I was originally saying, if you put the two of them together, they'll be like the perfect Targaryen king. Very similar to Jaehaerys, who's their grandfather. But that's not the case, and, it's split up. I will say that even though Daemon has that Targaryen prince disease, if there weren't dragons around at this time, Daemon would likely be another Viserys, right? Well, that's not fair because Viserys is the beggar king, right? He's for sure a piece of shit. He abuses Dany, but he's known as the beggar king because he has to keep asking people for shit because he's like, technically I'm the rightful heir to the Sunset Kingdoms across the Narrow Sea. Technically, if you help me out now, I'll be able to technically help you out later, right? That's kind of his whole thing, right? He's very much a bitch-ass nigga. But because Daemon and the Targaryens are in power and they have their dragons, Daemon ultimately doesn't fly too far off the handles. Now, his nephews, Aemond and Aegon too, kind of pick up that pursuit, but Daemon ultimately, once the dance starts, becomes a wizened battle commander. Like, yes, he was scrapping on the streets with random people in King's Landing, but ultimately, his life's journey leads him to a good spot. And I'd love to see if, everybody knows he dies in the battle above the gods. I'd love to see him initially survive that because Caraxes did. Caraxes pulled himself up onto the shore, and it just makes sense if the dragon survived it, then obviously the dragon rider would survive it for somewhat. Maybe ended up living out the last of his days with the Nettles off in the woods witch. Now, one more interesting thing. This whole video is going to be about Daemon. When he initially marries Rhaenyra, right? So at this time, the brothers, King Viserys and Daemon quarrel multiple times. At this time, when he marries Rhaenyra, right? So remember I mentioned that he had a bastard child with Mysaria. He doesn't have his first actual children until Baela and Rhaenyra are born, right? So his twin daughters are born, but after he marries Corlys's daughter Rhaenyra, and he's able to do this even though he's at quarrels with the king because House Velaryon are extremely powerful. So they can't necessarily change what the king says, but they can go around it, right? So at the time, Rhaenyra had this dude who was a bastard from Pentos, I think. He was someone who was betrothed to her, but Daemon got rid of him. They end up getting married, and they elope, and they go across the Narrow Sea. Now, that's the interesting part, because according to some of the sources, when they do that, they may have actually gone to Old Valyria, despite its curse. Like Rhaenyra and Daemon could have flown their dragons, Vhagar and Caraxes. Remember, Vhagar was around during the conquest, right? during Aegon's conquest. So this is this massive dragon. So anywhere they go across the Narrow Sea, they're greeted welcomely, right? Once they start to go further and further away from Westeros and the Sunset Kingdoms, Daemon and his wife are no longer welcomed as much. But for the most part, what they did during this time is unknown. Now, what the fuck? What was my whole point in all of that? I guess another thing about it, there's rumors that they could have gone to Valyria and Daemon could discover some of the secrets of the old Dragon Lords. So we do know that Daemon, Nettles was called a Woods Witch, right? Mysaria is the White Worm. She knows a lot of information. She's basically a female Varys, right? There's some mystical attributes to his character. Now, I don't know how much of that is going to be shown on screen, but because there's like these different sources, the writers of this show get to pick which one they like the most and expand upon it, right? So that's kind of going to be interesting to see which way they go with this show. I guess we could talk about Rhaenyra because she's another amazing character for this show and probably going to be one of the main ones. So the biggest thing to note about Rhaenyra is that she is the princess of Dragonstone. She sits at the foot of the throne to most of Viserys' meetings, and King Viserys' meetings. And when King Viserys loses a hand to the king, he actually considers Rhaenyra as replacing his hand to the king for a minute, but then he realizes, no, she'll obviously have to bring her children, and if King Viserys' grandchildren come back to court, they're going to quarrel with his actual children because even though he has male heirs, Rhaenyra was like succeeds them because she came first, and Viserys made up his mind like, hey, I want my daughter to succeed me, even though that's not the case. It wouldn't be that big of a deal if his choosing, like if when Jaehaerys handed the reins of the kingdom down to Viserys, if there hadn't been this massive quarrel about Rhaenys being jumped over, and then the son that was in her belly, who ended up being Laena, Daemon's wife, got jumped over, and then Corlys got jumped over, ultimately choosing for Viserys. If that hadn't have happened, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal, because literally Jaehaerys, the old king, like the most respected Targaryen king, had just said, regardless if you have a female heir that's born before the male heir, it always has to go to the male heir, regardless of age, regardless of male heirs that may be from or regardless of older female heirs that may be from a male heir, right? With Rhaenys, it went to Viserys, and there had not been this great precedence that was set in the Great Council of 101 AC, it wouldn't have been that big of a deal. But Viserys was just like an easygoing dude, and he knew that if he just deadened the questions of succession, it would be taken care of. He's like, I don't want to hear no more about this shit. My daughter is going to be next in line for the Iron Throne, and then eventually her son Jaehaerys will take over. There's actually a moment in the books in Fire and Blood where King Viserys has Jaehaerys, Rhaenyra's firstborn son, sitting on his lap, and he says, one day this will all be yours, right? So Viserys, in his attempts to try to keep peace, he makes the Greens hate him more and more. Like, Alicent and Rhaenyra become more and more at odds, and it doesn't help that the sins of the father pass on to the sins of the son, or in this case, the sins of the mother passed on. Like, Alicent and Rhaenyra's hatred towards each other passed on to their children, and there was never really anything that was done to deaden that. Like, Targaryens marry siblings, and I think Alicent suggested that Rhaenyra and her son Aegon too get married, so that way you could put all the rules of succession and you would ultimately dead all that. But Viserys was like, no, I'm not doing it. That's not the case. They don't even get along. I don't think that would be a good idea. But one of the things that he does do later on is with Daeron the Daring and one of Rhaenyra's children, they make them milk brothers. But that doesn't necessarily help because obviously the Dance of Dragons still happens. So one of the interesting things about Rhaenyra's character is that when you read Fire and Blood, like initially it was one of my first thoughts too until I thought about it some more and started analyzing. It's like she is not a warrior queen like Visenya, like Aegon the Conqueror's wife Visenya. Like Rhaenys was the poet, the lover. Aegon was truly in love with her, and Visenya is like he married her for duty. She was very much a warrior, right? She's the mother of Maegor the Cruel, right? So, holy shit, what was my whole point in all that? Okay, now I remember. It's like you hear about warrior queens like that, and then also Nymeria, who brought her people all the way over from the other side of the world and then eventually settled in Dorne and married into House Martell, right? When you hear about those warrior queens and then you read Rhaenyra's story, or at least we don't have her POV, so other people's version of her story, right? She is not a warrior. She kind of sits back and rules. She does what rulers do. And because of that, people complained. They wish that she could have at least mounted, her dragon Syrax at least 1 or 2 times during the war. And she does. She does take King's Landing. But it's also mentioned that Syrax grew fat. She didn't let him out to go and, fly him around when she's older and when she's really settling into herself. So Syrax gets fat, and it's not, the biggest and most ferocious dragon. So that kind of, because dragons are the embodiment of their riders, and the reverse of that, dragon riders are the embodiment of their dragons, that's kind of I guess, symbolic for what happens to Rhaenyra's character for a small amount of time. You just got to realize that she... unlike Daenerys and any of the not any of them. Unlike, we'll just say Daenerys is a good example. Daenerys was born very much like her brother, a beggar. So she starts out being this captive of this savage Dothraki lord, and then she becomes her own person, right? Rhaenyra has kind of had shit handed to her whole life. She's been the realm's delight, right? Everybody loves her. She's also, born into a time frame when the Targaryens are at their strongest ever. And because of this, she suffers from the ailments that, basically she has it too good. So that's why she makes choices, or at least the sources that we have telling us this time period of history from the Targaryen lineage, she kind of seems like she's less hands-on. I feel like this show could go one or two ways about that. Some of the thing, basically they could keep with canon and have it so that, yeah, she's very much a ruler. She rules. She has other people, her subjects, do the things that would put her life at risk. Because if she dies, well, then what's the whole point of any of this, right? It kind of makes sense when you look at it from that point. So the show could do it that way and keep in canon, but they could also make it so that she kind of, since we don't have her POV, there's not a 100% start to finish of her journey. They could add in things that were left out of the history books. So maybe Rhaenyra takes part in certain battles. Maybe she shows up later. Maybe when she goes to King's Landing, it's not as easy to take, and she doesn't just lock Helena up and throw her dragon in the dragon pit. Maybe there's a battle that ensues, right? So there are several things they could do with her character, and I'm kind of excited to see Emma Darcy play her on screen. Also, Millie Alcock. It'll be interesting to see if the reason why they wanted younger versions of the actresses, and then they don't have a younger version of Matt Smith and Patty Considine playing King Viserys and Prince Daemon, because they don't have children, right? And when you're the one who births the child, you age up a little bit, right? So especially if you have them at a young age, like Rhaenyra and Alicent do. So it'll be interesting to see if one of the main reasons why they did that was because, how I think, which is that, having children ages you, but also so that they could play a part in the 9 voyages of the Sea Snake show, the spinoff that they're doing with Corlys Velaryon. So that'd be pretty cool. He goes on many different journeys, and on one of them, he ends up loading up his ship with enough pelts and spices and rare shit like amber and stuff that they don't have in Westeros. He ends up loading it up with enough stuff to double House Velaryon's wealth. And during this time period, House Velaryon is richer than House Lannister, the Tyrells, and all of those rich-ass motherfuckers. So even though it's a brief period of time, they're still richer than all of them, like the Lannisters. Tywin shits rotten, smelly, stinky gold, right? House Velaryon's richer than them. So it'll be cool to see this show come to life. I can't wait until we get I want a trailer, sure, but I don't mind waiting on it if it means it's going to be better. What I want is a fucking release date. Just let us know when the show is going to come out. Do you guys not have enough people working on it to give you some sort of a deadline that you can at least tell if it's going to be coming out the month? I don't know. It's getting frustrated. That's why I took a little bit of break from House of the Dragon content. But not to worry. I've mentioned this before on my Twitter. Make sure you go follow me at Sir_Hunts. Just wrap this video up. I've already made one, or at least I've started. I've almost finished making that video. This is why I didn't edit this one that much. Where I do a book to show breakdown. So I go through season 1 and I compare episode 1 to what happens in the amount of POV chapters that are covered in the first episode, and so on and so forth. And I just, add in my little witty stuff. And those are actually scripted videos. So I changed the format up on that one. Anyway, I want to thank you all so much for watching. My name is Mark, and this has been Sir Hunt's Long Night Reviews. Slap a like on this video, please. Also, consider checking out my Patreon, because last month, I spent more money on Audible than I actually made from YouTube. And that's, you know what?